Good evening. This is May Brussel in Carmel, California. This is tape number 380, and this is March the 16th, 1979, side 1. This is income tax season for you. I don't have to remind all of you of that horrendous fact. And I'm going to do an update of the news this week on the tape and read to you some memos that I sent to the Internal Revenue in May of 1972. That was just 1 month before the Watergate arrest, asking for a refund of my taxes from 1971. I'll read this to you just to show you where my head was 7 years ago. And after the update of the news and a few articles that I believe are of primary importance to share with you, I'm going to briefly go into a book which I received this week from a woman up in Vancouver, Washington, who heard my show with Bob Trepper when I was on the air February the 2nd. And she sent me some documents of a course that she's taking in education where she believes that the university is purposely teaching them not to teach, a double-talk kind of 1984 procedure, and many of the textbooks are written in the United States. And this woman sent me about 40 pages of the textbooks to show me what she meant and asked me if she should go to a lawyer or what should she do about this course where she's supposed to be learning and she isn't learning. And then last week she mailed me a book. I've given you the name here. Alternative 3 it's called, and it's based on a television documentary that was in London last year. And this book was written because the British press wouldn't cover the story of that documentary, the American publishers wouldn't touch it, and the information for this book came from persons inside the government who were afraid of the consequences of their not speaking up. And the book was published similar, they compared it to the deep throat of Watergate, breaking a story that is suppressed. Now the thing about this book, Alternative 3, is that I've received many manuscripts and books from listeners throughout the years, and I'm very grateful for them. Many magazines and many pieces of that puzzle of who is doing the conspiring and who is doing the killing and the cover-up. But I can't remember in 15 years ever having a reaction to a book such as I received, and I just got it this last week. This book made me nauseous, and I wanted to vomit, and I wanted to faint. I wanted to cry. I wanted to bang the walls down. I literally had the shakes for about a week. It was so scary because it just could be the bottom line of these conspiracies, and I believe it probably is the most important book I've read in many, many years. I'd like to do the whole tape on it, but I'm going to do other material, and I know there won't be time to cover it, and we'll go into it more next week. But I don't want to go one more week without telling you about this book, and I'll be ordering some. I don't think it's safe for you to order them from England from the publisher because they'll keep track of where they come from. I'll use my source in Canada and get them, and I'm getting some for Tom Davis, who has the bookstore in Capitola Research. I'll give you the address there, and maybe he'll be able to get them for you. I think they should all come to one place so that it's not so noticeable, and I don't have any doubt in my mind that this is a very dangerous document to have, probably the most dangerous thing which I possess in my library at this point. And the only thing that will relieve the danger is to share it and disseminate the information. It was like Karen Silkwood going to the New York Times with documentation, but the week before she met the writer, she was already filled with uranium poisoning from bologna put in her refrigerator. This book is out. It belongs to everybody, and we're going to talk about it, but it's a terribly shaking book. It explains the UFOs that are out. It explains the Antarctica area that I've been talking about, the Nazification of the world with Wernher von Braun, and the NASA space program as being behind the Nazification. This book explains missing persons, thousands, hundreds of thousands of missing persons, the plan for genocide of millions to billions of persons, of separating people into useful or drone slaves, and it explains a lot about the mission, the moon trips. I've done tapes that we never went to the moon. It explains Jonestown. Is the one book that puts into focus all the other books and articles that I have received for the past 15 years. And so we're going to talk about Alternative 3, and then Alternative 4 should be what to do with the information once you have it. And I'm sure you read last week that a secretary from NATO, Ursula Lorenzen, defected to East Germany, to the communist side. She said that The Germans and the Nazis are coming back into power in Germany, have the atomic bomb for patriotic reasons. After 11 years as secretary to NATO, she has defected last week, as I say, to the other side. And I'm going to have a sweatshirt made, Bravo Ursula Lorenzen, for this reason. She's warning us about this Holocaust, this war that we're getting straight into. And it's going to be those kind of people, such as James McCord, who broke the Watergate story, or Ursula, who have a conscience, who are going to come forward. And that book, Alternative 3, was written by people, not many, but several, who had a conscience and came forward and gave documentation to the people in London doing a TV show on science. This woman left the office of the Secretary General Joseph Luns of NATO. He's a NATO civilian, 67-year-old civilian who was listed just 2 weeks ago as being a member of the Dutch wing of Hitler's National Socialist movement from 1933 to 36, and there's in the archives in Amsterdam documentation that he was an active member of the Nazi Party. He's claiming otherwise, but his record stands for him. All of this bookkeeping works two ways. They can keep books on us, but actually the Nazis kept very good books so that members of the Nazi Party are also listed. And this man happens to work with NATO, worked with General Haig, who wants to come home and be the President of the United States, or run the Olympic Games for the United States and turn that into one large defense intelligence operation. But Luns is the NATO civilian official who's been exposed as part of the Dutch wing of Hitler's Nazi group. And this woman defected over to the other side because of fear of atomic attacks that they had against the Soviet Union, and she thought the world should know. So the heroes of this book, Alternative 3, should not get lost. We have to spread the word about them. And the hope we have is that maybe, if we get enough information out and talk shows and radio shows and use this material, to demand that the Houston Control Centers for the Space Labs and at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and so forth, be accounted for and accountable to us, and find out exactly how far this Operation Alternative 3 has gone. As I say, as long as we're alive, the situation isn't hopeless. It's when you stop thinking that you can't make changes that you're in serious trouble. And the very fact that this woman went over to the other side to avert an atomic war in Europe means that people are ready to defect. And if you become intelligent and knowledgeable, they will respond to the newspaper articles you write, the radio shows, the correspondence. They will come forward and give information, and that's the only way we're going to get it, and that's the main way to get it, from people in the inside who defect. Now back to my taxes that I filed in 1972, because I think I should share this with you and compare it or read parts of a new book that just came out on the Klan by Patsy Sims that supports what I was alleging in 1972. I have many documents to support what I tried to get through in terms of a lawsuit. I went to Francis Heisler, an attorney here on the peninsula, to sue the government at the time for my back taxes, but he said it wouldn't work. For the Department of Internal Revenue, May 18, 1972. This is a letter that you have to send with a request after your taxes are paid, or else they tie up everything you have, and then I have a copy that I put right in with the taxes. Dear Sirs, enclosed is a form requesting a refund of my paid taxes for the year 1971. There are spaces for financial changes in your tax form. I'm not asking for a change in any particular case. I'm asking for a total refund of paid taxes. To support this existing government in any way financially is to give approval to legalized murder and assassination. Many people are presenting tax cases in objection to the Vietnam War. To my way of thinking, Vietnam is a small fraction of a major sickness. The United States of America was overthrown by a coup d'etat on November 22nd, 1963. The killing of President John Kennedy was done for the purpose of maintaining the power in this nation that was tightened with clandestine controls following World War II. Nazi generals, scientists, makers of war machinery, ammunition, were located into this country with the help of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. The State Department and the intelligence agencies combined their energies and relocated Nazi headquarters in a tightly controlled enclave in Tyrol in Jamaica. John Connolly, who was former head of the Treasury Department until this week, that was the week of May 72, is a member of that clandestine Nazi group. The National Archives contains proof of the conspiracy that I talk about. The documents are locked up for 75 years. The clothing of John Kennedy, the x-rays of his medical autopsy belong to every person. The holes in the garment should be examined by every person, and every citizen should know there was a conspiracy. The taxes people pay support a budget of between $60 and $80 million. That was a small budget in those days, to keep documents locked in the National Archives. My taxes, if I sent them to you, will be spent to pay the keepers to lock up information about the conspiracies that killed President John Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, and Reverend Martin Luther King. A democracy needs few secrets. The Freedom of Information Act is not being properly used. All reports and evidence of these murders belong to the people. The Justice Department hires political assassins. That was 1 month before the Watergate arrest, and later John Mitchell went to jail for covering up the Watergate, but wasn't responsible for the shooting of George Wallace or the Chappaquiddick affair, being behind the scenes, but he was the Attorney General. And these are the kind of people I was talking about. Straight through, the Justice Department hires political assassins. I said the Treasury Department hires political assassins. The Justice Department manipulates their trials so that real facts and the evidence are never exposed. The executive branch of the government, the president, locks up the existing evidence of the conspiracies. My taxes would pay public servants who are digging our graves. When the proof of the escalation of the war is exposed, political assassination will have been a major factor in allowing our Nazi, racist, barbarian behavior. I wrote, enclosed is the letter which went with my original payment. It is self-explanatory. In addition to that information, I have other reasons for wanting a refund. The Department of the Treasury, through agents of tobacco, alcohol, and firearms, makes deals for assassinations inside the United States. I have copies of tapes, arrangements for your agents who were agreeing to bring Eldridge Cleaver home in a box. You allow men with narcotics charges out on the streets in exchange for murdering civil rights leaders, minority leaders, and you keep the flow of narcotics going when it could be stopped. My particular interest is in political assassinations. The Treasury Department, as guilty as the justice, is destroying democracy and replacing it with fascism. To support this system with my taxes is identical to the fools in Nazi Germany who bought their own gas chambers. I also got back a letter from the Treasury Department. They answered me in 1972, November 24th, 1972, and they said the claim for refund is disallowed. The reasons on your claim are not considered valid, and your claim for refund is denied. That was claim number 1,797, the Tax Franchise Board. They turned down that application in November of 72, but by June of 72, Watergate had broken, and then we had the chain of command of John Ehrlichman in the White House working with Robert Haldeman and hiring E. Howard Hunt and James McCord, and then under them was John Caulfield, who was speaking for the President of the United States and calling James McCord and threatening to kill him. He had a New York detective police office, and Caulfield worked with Tony Lasowitz, who also was threatening James McCord, and they wanted him to sign the agreement that everybody arrested at Watergate was guilty, and it didn't go any higher than that. And it was James McCord who broke the story that the Justice Department, the FBI, and various high-level government agencies were involved in Watergate and in the cover-up. And it turned out that the agents I was referring to, I was talking about Larry Shears, an agent provocateur of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, who made tapes with the Treasury Department, and I have his press conferences and a tape recording of them ranging to kill Cesar Chavez at that time and Eldridge Cleaver. I think the reason those men are alive today was because Larry Shears broke the story, and it was linked directly to the Internal Revenue and the way they offer parole to people inside jail if they'll go out and kill these labor leaders and civil rights leaders. And at that time, Eldridge Cleaver was very political. He wasn't working for the system. He was working with the Black Panthers and was very political enough to make arrangements. They were arranging for Sonny Barger of the Hells Angels, a narcotic dealer, a convicted narcotic dealer, to be out and a chance to get out or stay out from jail if he would bring Eldridge Cleaver home dead in a box. He'd escaped over to Algeria, and they were considering letting Barger do the transition for them in exchange for his not serving time in prison. There's a new book out now called The Klan by Patsy Sims. It just came out in 1978. That's quite a bit longer. That's 6 years since I made these allegations, and about the Treasury Department working with Nazis and killing Jews and bringing Nazis into this country and their assassination teams. And I just want to read you a few pages from this new book that just came out because it's apropos of the tax season, and I think it's 6 years later after she wrote this book, 6 years after I put these claims to the Treasury Department, and they turned me down for the refund. She has reference here to an agent, Roy Frankenhauser. Many of you have read about him. He's an agent provocateur who worked for the Klan, and she describes that he was arrested more than 60 times with charges from inciting a riot to conducting disorderly Klan rallies. He worked for the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party, the Minutemen, the National States Right Party, and then he became a federal informer for the narcotics departments, the IRS and the Treasury Department and the FBI. And this career ended when he was selling dynamite to another Klan member by the name of Robert Mills, a former Grand Dragon in Michigan. And he was at the time of the school bus bombings in Pontiac. And this agent provocateur was selling him dynamite. He's been picked up, I say, many times as Frankhauser, and was supplying the dynamite. She says Frankhauser contended he took part in the scheme of selling this dynamite in Michigan because he was acting as an informant for the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, the same agencies that I was complaining about. He said the government asked him to act for them, the ATF, but then if he was arrested, of course, they disassociate themselves and say he was on his own. As a result of being involved in supplying this dynamite in February of 1974, he was given 5 years probation and suspended sentence, which was what I said, that the criminals are out on the streets and the drug dealing goes on, and also the sending of dynamite. These provocateurs are out. He had a 5 years probation and a suspended sentence. His somewhat mysterious spy assignment hinted of CIA ties. He was supposed to go to the Black September group that was going to kill American Zionist leaders. That mission, according to him, was approved by the National Security Council, the White House, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms John Caulfield, who later figured in the Watergate scandal when he tried to persuade burglar James McCord to remain silent for White House clemency. Frankenhauser's turbulent life has included testifying before the House on American Activity, and he watched the suicide in his apartment of the New York Dragon Daniel Furrow. Frankenhauser worked with such great people as J.B. Stoner. That's the man that James Earl Ray's brother works for. Stoner had ties to explosives that were extensive. Patsy Sims writes about. They were involved with bombings, the Emmett Miller bombing that he was charged with in Little Rock in 1961, the 4 Klansmen accused of a blast in the home of a black boy who integrated an elementary school in Florida in 1964, the 1971 school bus bombing in Pontiac that I mentioned. Frankenhauser supplied dynamite for this person, and he's even been linked with Mr. Byron de la Beckwith, who was never convicted but was twice tried for killing civil rights leader Medgar Evers and involved with time bombs and bombing a Jewish leader's home, his car. Frankenhauser, she says, Roy Frankenhauser, the former Pennsylvania Grand Dragon, filled 240 pounds of explosives to miles and was involved with bombings that had to do with the Atlanta Synagogue in 1958 and the Stoners Christian Anti-Jew Party and so forth. But this very person, this Roy Frankenhauser, was working with anti-Semites, bombing Jewish homes, civil rights leaders, supplying ammunition and bombs, and claimed that he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and for John Caulfield and the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the exact group that I asked for to come up and explain their role in those murders that were taking place through this entire period. If I could find an honest lawyer, and I think that's a contradiction or a catch-22 or whatever, I would refile that lawsuit based on everything that's been published by the government hearings and by various researchers in the past years and showed that I was right, the Nazi links, the alcohol, tobacco, firearms, the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, the law courts covering up, and how these people do get out and spread their virulent disease of hate all over the world. That's what I was complaining about, murder and more murders in 1972, and I felt my money was going for that purpose or could be used for that purpose, and I resented having to pay it. They didn't feel that way, and they took my taxes anyway. Incidentally, the same John Connally that I mentioned is working with the Nazis, and the Treasury Department, the Secretary of the Treasury at that time, is now gaining on Ronald Reagan and announced that he wants to be a presidential candidate. The very person that helped resettle the Nazis after World War II down in Jamaica is second choice of the people under Reagan or close to Reagan. Reagan, Ford, and Connally are neck to neck, and it doesn't matter which one of these you choose. They're very much close to the same team. I think that Reagan has the best chance of getting the nomination, but because there's so much coming out about the government, and Connally was so close as Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of the Treasury, and with his role with Lee Harvey Oswald, his correspondence with Oswald, and his knowledge of the assassinations, it may be necessary to put one more team member in instead of changing to Ronald Reagan at this time, because John Connally has the answers to these secrets and knows how to put the lid on better than a new man in Washington, such as Ronald Reagan, because Jerry Ford was on the Warren Commission and worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and had to cover and squeal to the FBI as an informer all the time that the Warren Commission was working, and controlled the Associated Press and the United Press, working as a joint FBI and CIA man. I knew that that was why he was appointed by Richard Nixon when Richard Nixon went out of office, because Nixon had put him on the Warren Commission, and he was held there to hold the line. That's why he was on second call and became President of the United States. And if they're desperate enough and enough information keeps coming out, they may have to push a Connally ticket, because he has been the head of these agencies, so he'd know how to put the lid on and knows who the agents are. It'd be pretty dangerous to bring a new man like Reagan into Washington when there's so much information out that could turn this government around, similar to the way that Iran went, if the people really caught on to what was happening back there. And I hope they catch on pretty soon. There was a television program this week, a national program on John Arthur Paisley. I did 2 tape cassettes on Paisley. If you don't have them, you can get those. I'm not going to rerun those for you. I did an article for Penn Jones newsletter, the continuing inquiry, on Yuri Nosenko, the missing link, ? And I'll give you the address. You can order those from Penn and read the article I did for him. I think it writes very well. I think it's a good article, and if you read it and get it, you can study the difference of my interpretation of that missing CIA man as against what the national program has to tell you on TV. If you weren't around to study the John Kennedy assassination, it was a long time ago, and it's hard to relate to that far away. Take this Paisley story, because he just was missing in September of '78, and then take the news media 3 nights in a row, a cover-up with a full-page ad in the newspapers, confidential. Nobody realized how important the CIA officer was until he died. And then they called in James Angleton, head of counterintelligence, to deny that John Paisley was important or that he even knew him. And they brought in William Colby, formerly of the head of the CIA and head of the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia. And when you saw them on the screen, if you saw them, this denial that they did, it was so much like Watergate, and anybody with a keen eye would know that these men were lying through their teeth. But it seems that the major media had to tell you, we've done an investigation. Yes, he was controversial, but he had marital problems, and that would make him shoot himself in the head and put a weight around and sink himself. That would make him disappear. Or his contract with the CIA was going to be up in a month, and therefore he was going to be unemployed, and therefore he killed himself. And those are good motives, so don't worry. We found out that he was going to be unemployed. Well, when he went under, they said he hadn't worked for the CIA for a long time, so if they can make one lie, they can make another lie. And another point is that when he disappeared, he had on his boat equipment from the National Security Agency and the Defense Department, and his wife, who was in the CIA, took a former agent of the Defense Department or present agent to the boat to help sanitize or take papers out. So the fact that his unemployment in the CIA was going to end in October of 1978, and he decided because it was a month ahead of being fired he'd kill himself in September doesn't make sense, because he didn't have to be employed by them at all. When they get on the screen and tell you he was no longer going to be working for the CIA, then they have to explain why he was working with George Bush, who was formerly director of the CIA, and the Harvard Committee on the most sensitive documents that the United States has on Russian satellites. And the background of Paisley is so interesting and mysterious, and they don't explain why he would do himself in if he's working for the Defense Department or the National Security Agency. But they come through this story, marital problems, again with a psychiatrist, a woman who said he was always edgy and not sure of his relationship and his divorce, and therefore he shot himself in the back of the head, put a weight around his waist, and went under. And that's why they had to bury him without his wife seeing him, cut off his hands, and cremate him, and unload this body without proper identification or dental plates, which the dentist did explain. And then the FBI expects you to trust them. All-knowing FBI, believe us. All-knowing ABC, believe us. Don't talk anymore about John Paisley, because that's just rumor. We checked it all out, and there's nothing to the story. Remember what they said on TV. If you didn't hear it, you didn't lose anything. And either way, get the article from Penn Jones and read it, and play my 2 tapes on Paisley, and remember that a lot is happening. And the book that I'm going into, Alternative 3, is into killing agents and missing people. And John Paisley is missing. His wife doesn't think he's dead, and he could be among the missing people. One other matter, a serious matter, and then on side 2, I guess all of side 2, we'll get into Alternative 3. I told you, many of you people know who hear these tapes, many of your personal friends now, long friends, and I've known you a long time through correspondence and telephone calls and so forth. You know that I've been frantically trying to collect old books put out from 1929 until 1950. The CIA came into power in 1947, and they began their own publishing and taking over the publishing empire. So a lot of information on the origins of World War I and World War II are in older books. I have a book, Army of Spies, by Joseph Gehlen, published by Macmillan in 1939. Invaluable book. Another one, All Honorable Men, I've borrowed. It belongs to a friend. If you can find it for me. James Martin, 1950. The Great Conspiracy, Michael Sayers, Little Brown and Company, 1946. Kurt Reese, The Nazis Go Underground, Doubleday and Doran, 1944. Hitler's Heirs, Pyramid Books, October 61. Well, I read in the San Jose Mercury an article this week that they had a book burning at San Jose State campus. 7,500 books were burned from the San Jose State Library. And the thing that's worrying me is that I get newspapers from all over the country, and other places are burning books. And it worries me because I go up to the San Jose used bookstores, and I've been getting books and turning people to the libraries to read these books. And I don't know how much the radios and cassettes and talk shows are doing to escalate this, whether I'm paranoid or whether something very sinister is happening. But there's an article here that compares it to Nazi Germany. In the San Jose Mercury this week, it said, book burning controversy flares anew. San Jose State Library, where on the campus they burnt 7,500 books to make room for new books that are coming. They're going to junk 15,000 volumes. We'll do a little bit more of this on the other side and then get right into this horrible book, Alternative 3, that I just have to share with you now. Please. Good evening. This is May Brussel. This is side 2 of tape number 380. March 16th, 1979. Next week on tape 381, I'll give you a clear-cut outline that you can follow on this book that I'm going to share with you, Alternative 3. But this week it'll be just random thoughts about the book and some information to share with you in general. And then I'll outline it for you, because when I take something really seriously, that's what I have to do to understand it, and it may help you to understand it also. I have a bibliography which I'm enclosing with my tapes for you. It's a piece of paper that I have had printed for several years now. I think the bibliography was made up in 3 or 4 years ago, after I finished the Patty Hearst article. I guess it was in 1974. And whenever I speak at colleges or organizations and schools, I was speaking at the Carmel High School last week for the leadership class. If I teach classes, it's very confusing for people to hear so much information and not have something tangible that they can hold in their hand to read and look up for themselves. So this sheet of paper that I have, I always have printed when I lecture before groups, and they can take it home with them, because people want information on John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Chappaquiddick, Wallace, the intelligence system, and so forth. And I've selected what I consider a good list of books for a background into some of the conspiracies that are taking place. I have a list of 15 circle rings that I've talked about before. I call it the interlocking conspiracy rings, the elements that constitute a conspiracy. If any one of them falls apart, the whole conspiracy would be exposed if these links get weak and fall apart. But then I listed a section on the front page of this of the order of importance of information out to understand the assassination syndrome and the murdering of political leaders, or the causes for World War III, which I believe a long time ago was imminent. And while there's some very fine books on the back side, and I have a library of literally thousands of books now, I listed in importance down here 6 pieces of information that I thought in that order were the clue to a lot of the crimes of the government, the major crimes going on. And the first book I listed was Clarence Lansby's book, Project Paperclip. And I've given you this list here, and you can follow it. And this was the importation of these Nazis into the United States, 642 Nazi science specialists who could bring their expertise to this country in order to arm again for World War III. They wouldn't be satisfied just to settle for a new world, for peace, for shame, or guilt. By 1943, as it's being documented now and researched in books, they had already decided to get ready for the next war, and they hid a lot of their rocket inventions and so forth away as barter for coming to this country. Now, there was something in Project Paperclip which comes out in the book, this book that I have, Alternative 3, and there was something on my mind out of this whole book that never left my consciousness. I've forgotten a great deal of the book. It's 350 pages long. But there were 2 paragraphs, 2 sections here that have stayed very firm in my mind all of these years, that I picked out as being terribly important. One, I'll read you page 42 to 43, the gist of what they were saying in Project Paperclip. It told about the German scientists, their value being somewhere between $400 and $500 million, their estimated value, and they were brought into this country, and one gentleman that was responsible for bringing them in, a Mr. Staver, was very excited because it says in Project Paperclip, by having these people here, it could ensure the supremacy of the United States in rocket development. They listened as they described their future plans. They would construct an outer station useful for astronomers and for the launching of spaceships into the stellar regions. They would construct a large reflector for focusing the sun's rays onto the Earth for power generating purposes. The latter would be used for another objective, described as a terrible thing, a weapon which will enable the first country to achieve this undertaking to rule the entire world. The focusing of this reflector upon any living persons would kill them immediately. Ocean water would be instantly turned to steam, a forest instantly kindled. Impressed by the Germans' advanced thinking and receptive to their expressed desired to continue this work in the United States, Mr. Staver urged in a recommendation to the Chief Ordnance Officer of Paris that 100 of these scientists be evacuated immediately within 30 days. He went so far as to suggest the Spectu Island at Aberdeen Proving Ground useful for them to complete the development of the Wasserfall and for subsequent long-range rocket research. And with great pride and before such time as the U.S. Navy and British would do the same, he said, let us get them to the United States. We will be a major world power. This is such an exciting thing. Bring them over. Now that stayed in my mind a long, long time, almost as much as anything I've read of all of my research. And in this book, which is a story of scientists putting on a television show in England, and as a result of that show, other people came forward to them. It innocently started as a brain drain lift of people from England going to the United States, the Middle East, Europe, and Australia. And they wanted to do a study of why these people, 4 million people, have left Great Britain, 1/3 of them scientists and very important, well-trained people, why they're not staying in Britain. And they thought that they should investigate this. And they came across an astronomer who was at NASA in Houston, Texas, who had wind of this plan for extermination and for purposes other than what we're saying our space exploration is for, but which the Project Paperclip hints at. And this particular astronomer had a freak automobile accident. They described the London Times talking about this freak accident. His name was Mr. Ballantyne, an astronomer. And there were headlines of this car crash that they had. February the 6th, 1977, Sir William Ballantyne was looking at his watch. He was waiting for a phone call and a message, and it had to do with something that happened in the NASA headquarters in Houston, Texas. And he was going to London when his car went off the road. It careered off the road on a journey to London. He was a competent and steady driver, and he was killed. Only one photograph of the crash was available to the press and the television, and a whole series were taken by agency cameraman George Green, but only one was released, and it showed part of the wreckage with a blanket-covered shape on a stretcher. He had what were orders. They got tape recordings of the plans to kill him, and it was called a hot job. He had extensive burns all over his body, and it goes into the coroner's report. But the important thing was that the hot job was ordered in Palo Alto at Stanford University, and it gives the name of the scientist. And from Palo Alto, California, they could burn and cause a car crash of this well-known famous astronomer in London, England, who got wind of the plans of these extermination of millions and millions of people. He describes in this book, the author, Leslie Watkins, and there were a team that wrote this book, that Sir William Ballantyne's freakish death, which wasn't far from his base at Jodrell Bank, that's where the astronomers worked, was mirrored by an aerospace professor called Peterson near Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. Nor did they know of the monthly conferences beneath the ice of the Arctic Ocean where they meet on submarines and plan their next moves. This book says by 1951 the V-2 rocket, a relic of World War II, had been superseded by very sophisticated missiles by 1951. We had brought the scientists over, and this particular astronomer, Mr. Ballantyne, had been to Houston, Texas, and got wind of what the NASA headquarters are about. And therefore, they've alleged here, and not lightly and with coroner's reports, that he was murdered by officers who were ordered to do this hot job on him, which is called an expediency, a scientist professor by the name of Peterson from Palo Alto, California. I'm jumping right into this horrendous book because Project Paperclip was the first on my list of urgency of books to read to understand what is going on in the world now, what happened in the past, and how to predict the future. And I'm citing a quotation from this new book which uses a technique that I feared would be used soon by those scientists, and how it was used to murder a man who had information about future plans that are going to affect all of our lives. There's one thing that's been worrying me about Jonestown that I might or might not have mentioned on the tapes, but if you take Time magazine, go to your library and look it up if you don't have it, the issue on Jonestown, right after the death, and Newsweek, and read the books that have come out. There's 3 books out on Jonestown that I have already. The photographs that you've seen are limited to about 20 shots, and the bodies were lying there for 2 days when the photographers were called in. And as Time, Newsweek, LA Times, and various news media swarmed in. And they brought their cameras, I assume 35 millimeter or whatever, and the books came out, but the only pictures allowed of Jonestown are a set of about 20 pictures. Now, there were 910 people dead, but there's one shot of that vat with a woman lying close to the vat with the arm tag on her. You can see her. There are pictures of a man and woman with a child between them, again with body tags, which I believe are purposes of experimentation. There's a shot of the drugs that somebody took, and there's aerial photographs of Jonestown, and there's a couple of rooms that have been taken inside of Jim Jones' room, and a mass one of the dining room and of Jim Jones. But the 3 books in the major magazines and all the articles on Jonestown, considering how many men went down there and how many thousands of pictures they could take if they were shooting of all kinds of people, they only selected a few, and it's similar to this scientist dying in England. Only one shot was allowed, and all the other pictures were taken by somebody else. And in Jonestown, blankets were covered over these people. Now, there are only beds for 600 people, and 910 bodies were found, and Mark Lane came out again last week and referred to 1,100 people. So there's a discrepancy in the figures. The blankets were thrown over so we couldn't see them. But the bodies were so terribly decomposed, they said that you couldn't tell whether they were black people or white people, and they had 900 passports, but they never were linked to the people down there because they said the names had changed. And in this book, Alternative 3, it talks about 15 wild ponies dying, similar to the cattle mutilations in this country. And this was in the London Daily Mail, July 15th, 1977, and said that men with face masks and metal detectors went around in Geiger counters trying to find out what happened to 15 wild ponies that were found dead, their bodies mangled and torn apart. To add to the riddle, their bodies were decomposed to virtual skeletons within 48 hours. Now, after the men left Jonestown and before the army came, these bodies were so decomposed that they were peeling fingers off, and the skin had so rotted, as I say, you couldn't tell anything about these people. And I wonder if the same type of experimentations or chemicals or a neutron bomb kind of effect could have taken place down in Jonestown, similar to that is happening to these camel mutilations, because here they were in England, decomposed within 48 hours, and it doesn't seem that if the CIA told Jimmy Carter who was killed and how many were killed within moments after Leo Ryan was killed and they had a station at Matthews Ridge, it doesn't seem possible that planes couldn't have come down within 24 hours and taken everybody back before the decomposing took place. And I think that the parallels between Alternative 3 and Jonestown have to be considered in the decomposition of the body, the blankets, and the lack of original photographs, that they stuck with just a select few and have not allowed any of the others or any other people or their faces to be seen. The bodies were turned face down, and we really haven't seen if they were shot, blown up, or the condition of the bodies. By the time those photographers came, we don't even know if some of them had exploded or what had happened to them, face down with blankets over them. That second book on my bibliography of importance to understand yesterday, today, and tomorrow is Cookeridge's book, Gehlen, Spy of the Century, put out by Random House in 1971, about Hitler's chief of intelligence, the Eastern Division, who came to the United States and was given a minimum of $200 million to form the CIA and to use his agents, the same agents against the Soviet Union one time, inside the Kremlin, and to use him to form from our OSS the CIA. If you don't understand Reinhard Gehlen, you can't understand the future. And again, in that book, Gehlen, Spy of the Century, just as Project Paperclip did Project, and yesterday, today, and tomorrow, is Cookeridge's book, Gehlen, Spy of the Century, put out by Random House in 1971, about Hitler's chief of intelligence, the Eastern Division, who came to the United States and was given a minimum of $200 million to form the CIA and to use his agents, the same agents against the Soviet Union one time, inside the Kremlin, and to use him to form from our OSS the CIA. If you don't understand Reinhard Gehlen, you can't understand the future. And again, in that book, Gehlen's Spy of the Century, just as Project Paperclip did Project Paperclip, there was one page that told me the whole story of Germany, of Gehlen, of Allen Dulles, of the whole bloody future. And this is what scares me so much about reading that book right now, Alternative 3. On page 50 and 51, it tells the plans that Gehlen and the Hitler team had for winning the war in Russia. Mr. Rosenberg, who was Hitler's Minister for Eastern Affairs, an important person in Adolf Hitler's career, had plans for the Soviet Union after her defeat. He would take Belarus with a population of 5.5 million, the cities of Minsk, Mogilev, and Wittstock, I don't know if I pronounced that right, and incorporate them into East Prussia, resettled by the Germans. Now this is the part of the book that really freaked me out, which is the purpose of writing Alternative 3, what's happening now with the intent of Gehlen. And given Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles and the money, $200 million, the intent of what he had, and then bringing him to this country and housing him over in Europe and treating him like a very fine general, is so horrendous. To not have kicked his ass and hung him or shot him is inexcusable. But to let that go is to relive the scene. And in Gehlen's Spy of the Century, this was the plan. The plan of Third Reich was to colonize under a top layer of German settlers and administered by German officials an area with a total population of over 50 million. It would extend to Moscow to include the Ukraine, the Crimea, the Black Earth region, and part of the Caucasus, including its very rich oil fields. The Russians and the Ukrainians within this German colony were to be treated in accordance with Aryan racial principles. They were to be treated as subhuman. They would receive only basic education and agricultural training with a view to turning them into a nation of slaves. All of Leningrad and the Karelian districts would be incorporated into Greater Germany. Now, Rosenberg's memorandum explains 50 million would be subhuman agricultural training, a nation of slaves, and 40 million Soviet citizens would be needed, they would have to eliminate, it would be needed to eliminate these people in the proposed colonial region. This would be achieved by natural means, namely famine. Rosenberg's conclusion was that in this way, the steppes would never again become a danger to Germany and German-dominated Europe. It's interesting to note that in this blueprint for Germany's treatment of Russia, it corresponded in its broad outlines with the policy proposed in books of Reinhard Gehlen's brothers and others published by the family printing firm. They didn't advocate wholesale genocide, not wholesale, but in this case, 40 million would immediately be killed of the Soviet citizens, and 50 million into subhuman agricultural training make them a nation of slaves. Are you sick yet? Are you ready to vomit? That's so much for those two books. Those books and those pages have been very important on my mind, and I've listed those as primary to read to understand what's going on. Now, when you get to Alternative 3, the idea behind Alternative 3 of NASA, Werner von Braun, and the Space Agency is to divide people into specifically two groups exactly as they have there, the useful people and the people that can be expendable, the people that they can do away with. They have terms for them that I'm going to share with you, and they're expendable, and they are separating people and classifying them into the desirables, into several groups, and this book goes into it, that the intent and the means are here now, and they say there's no use to complain about it. It's a fait accompli. There's nothing you can do about this anymore, so you may as well sit back and not get nervous about it. That's what, it's inevitable. Don't worry, the book says. It says that the President of the United States and the Russian leaders and the British have worked in unison to ensure what they consider to be the best possible future for mankind. The day-to-day details have been delegated to high-level professionals. It talks about Jimmy Carter, or the President of the United States. Does he have personal knowledge of the terror and the clinical cruelties, or the parts of the operation that are responsible for murders and mutilations? It goes on to say that that's left up to underlings, but I'm sure that he has to be advised of these things. These professionals are now classifying and has established and classified people into two groups to ensure, as I say, for what they consider is the future of mankind, the best future. They're classifying them for Alternative 3 operation into two categories: those who are picked as individuals and those who merely form a batch consignment. That is the name for slave labor, batch consignment. And these people are to live 15 years, and then they are to be expendable. They are only allowed to live 15 years, and then new ones are brought in because there's no provisions for their old age. There's nothing we're going to need for them. Now keep in mind, our Social Security is running out in old age. The inflation is going up the most on housing, food, medical care. And those are the things that you need, and that is where your inflation is the highest. And they have an Alternative 3 team that they've set up to decide. The part of this team is the batch consignment, and that's the treatment meted out to the men and women, this book says, that causes the most outrage. It says some of you may be revolted by some of the atrocities involved in this process, but Alternative 3 is separating people into two batches, and that's exactly what Reinhard Gehlen was planning in the 40s, and then was brought to the United States in 1945, and then funded. And Werner von Braun was brought down to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Walter Dornberger was brought to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and the satellite Nazi rocket weapons were built by the U's, the Boeing, particularly Lockheed and the U's. Various agencies have made these spaceships, getting ready for the segregation process and deciding who's going to live and who's going to die. So much for Reinhard Gehlen's Spy of the Century. The intent of that book was carried out, and if these authors are right, they're proceeding right on schedule. Can you see why I'm scared and sick at this book? I think I know too much. I think I've read too many books, and I think that this isn't a science fiction. The book is filled with documentation, and let me tell you right now, what I'm sharing with you is not science fiction. This television program in England, and we'll go back into the background of the book, was a documentary, a series of 26 documentaries on scientific programs, and the only thing that instigated this entire research was to study the brain drain from England out of the country. And when they began their research, they realized that many people who left England, and they cite 3 in particular cases, didn't show up where they were supposed to be. They became non-persons, and we'll talk about that. The plans for death are called acts of expediency, and various people that caught on to what was happening were warned. The politicians in Great Britain, several of them said, it's not necessary for you and others like you to be told of the unpalatable facts. That's what they told this television team. They argue that the events of the future are now inevitable. There is nothing to be gained by prematurely unleashing fear. These plans are now inevitable. There is nothing to be gained by prematurely unleashing fear. They're working on the idea of the biblical saying of Noah being able to live out the floods because he had advanced information. He was a good person, there would be floods, and everyone else would die. And they're collecting people selectively who will survive, similar to the biblical prophecies, and deciding on their slave master team. I don't want to wander too far off from this book, Alternative 3, but the information in here brings up so many pictures of my past work. But last week, March the 8th, a head of the Rockefeller Foundation, the scientific team, John Knowles, died. And I think of this because I read of the murder of this Mr. Ballantyne, a scientist that knew too much. He died at Boston Hospital. He was head of the Rockefeller Foundation, its president since 1972. He was 52 years old when he died, and one column said that he had cancer, and then another one quoted Henry Romney, the head director of the Rockefeller Foundation, saying this was a very unexpected, sudden death. 52 years old. Jonestown happened November 19th, 1978. Nelson Rockefeller was dead 2 months later, and I believe that the Venezuelan hospitals have a connection to the Jonestown experimentation, and that Nelson Rockefeller had a lot of property and interest in oil in Venezuela that has not been investigated as a possible link to experimentations in Jonestown. And then John Knowles is dead March the 8th, 1978, age 52, an unexpected death. And they described him as working for international relations, that he was concerned with global problems, which has another meaning when you think of the intelligence links of Nelson Rockefeller and the Rockefeller Foundation. But one of the obituaries said that he helped incorporate the International Agricultural Development Service. Now, you know Lawrence Layton's father, Dr. Layton, a Ph.D., was in charge of the chemical biological warfare at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Utah. I've talked about that on other tapes. Those of you that don't have that tape can get the ones that I did on Jonestown. He's in Berkeley working for Defense Department and for agricultural departments in the Department of Agriculture. The Rockefeller Foundation is working in International Agricultural Department. Reinhard Gehlen's project was with the Agricultural Department, and then this brilliant physician, this international person, died just last week. Robert Finch, working for Richard Nixon, wanted this particular gentleman, the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, to become head of Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Now, that was the group that, under Mr. Richardson, Elliot Richardson, that was funding money in Boston Hospital for lobotomies that Dr. Marks and Irvin and Sweet were doing. And I've talked about the lawsuit of Leonard Kiley back there. This Health, Education, and Welfare was funding these lobotomies and brain experimentations. And this particular gentleman, this doctor, head of the Rockefeller Foundation, John Knowles, was affiliated with this Boston hospital in Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and with the Rockefeller Foundation at the same time, and interested in agricultural developments and international agricultural developments and institutions of international relations. And I don't think we can afford to overlook any possible links of these people to these great agricultural developments, because, as this book points out, the Earth's population is growing so quickly that there's going to be too many people on the Earth, and they're polluting it too quickly, that they have to make provisions for a certain amount of numbers and sacrifice the others. And the agricultural plans are for these select slaves or drones to do enough to just keep the other people alive, so that the agricultural development of the undeveloped countries is just to select your slave labor. Only 30% of the population growth is coming from the more privileged developed countries, and 70% is coming from the underdeveloped. And these are the countries that will have to be wiped out, except for the batch consignments, which they're experimenting on now. And this book alleges that this is the cause of the Bermuda Triangle, or the pilot that disappeared recently. They didn't mention this in the book. The book, I guess, had just come out over Australia. And missing people and missing agents. And next week, there's not enough time, we're going to go into the missing people and the experimentations that are in this book. On July the 11th, 1977, the Los Angeles Times had an article. It's quoted in this book by a scientist from Princeton, Dr. Gerard O'Neill, who works with NASA and MIT, and he was given $500,000 to investigate population growth. And the LA Times had an article saying that now 4 billion people on the Earth. It will grow to 6.5 billion by the year 2000. That's 20 years from now. And 30% of the world population is in developed nations. So they decided there's absolutely too many people polluting the atmosphere and too many people on the Earth. And the political ramifications are such that they he's implying that they have to make some solution to this large amount of population. They had a meeting under the Antarctic submarines of what to do with Dr. O'Neill, and decided not to kill him for saying too much, because people wouldn't take the article seriously anyway. Well, our time is out. Next week I will go into this book in detail. I think this is enough to either whet your appetite or make you sufficiently nauseated. I hate to share the information, but it's really important. This is Mae Brussel in Carmel. I'll be with you next week, and stay well if you can.